us on the map. Mr. Caruana leading the beat. Australia global rank 6. Feeling the heat like immortality.
All right, so welcome to our next series of videos for Year 12 HMS. So what we are looking at in this series is our specific conditions and diseases which are leading towards morbidity and mortality statistics for Australians, okay? This will be a 3-part series, and our first one we are doing a deep dive into cardiovascular disease, all right? So cardiovascular disease, or CVD as it's abbreviated, all right? It is a broad term used to describe all diseases of the heart and blood vessels, and I've got some more specifics down below here. So atherosclerosis, you should have heard of this by now. It is the buildup of fatty plaque in our blood vessels. So if you took these two people, you've got this person's artery, all right, and it's quite free flowing, okay? There's a lot of blood flow able to get through here. I've circled this piece of plaque here because that could dislodge from the artery and then cause a blockage down the way. So like a tiny bit of plaque like that might lead to something like angina, which we'll get to in a sec. But then you look at this person's blood vessel and it is like nearly fully blocked over, okay? And this can lead to a couple of things. So first of all, because the blood flow is heavily restricted, this person's blood pressure will be much higher, okay? So the pressure of the force of the heart beating to push that blood through that is significantly higher than this person, all right? And that's why doctors use blood pressure readings as a good indicator to atherosclerosis and their actual heart and cardiovascular disease health. Secondly, if you think about a hose that's got lots of pressure going through it, it could burst, okay? So this could eventually just like pop out the side here, which is all this mess. And then that would be arteriosclerosis, so the breakdown of the blood vessels, and then obviously internal bleeding, etc., and that could be bad. Thirdly, what could happen is if the pressure kept up and it didn't burst, well then maybe the plaque might give way, and that whole chunk of plaque will then shoot down the bloodstream and cause a significant blockage somewhere, which is what a heart attack is. But we'll get to all that in a sec. So terms underneath cardiovascular disease. So we've got CHD, which is coronary heart disease, or IHD, which is ischemic heart disease. Okay, so these are the things that you'll actually find on the AIHW statistics reports. So these things include conditions like angina. So angina is a temporary loss of blood supply to the cardiac muscle, so the heart itself. And then you can have a full-on or full-blown heart attack, which is a complete blockage to the heart. Okay, so people that have heart attacks, what's happening is there is plaque here that is blocking the blood vessels that supply blood to the heart muscle itself, and therefore if the muscle doesn't get blood, well, it can't operate, so therefore the heart goes into, arrhythmia, and bad things happen. Hopefully you've got defib or CPR or other medical care. So we've also got the terms such as stroke, which is cerebrovascular disease, which is a blockage of blood supply to the brain. And we've got peripheral vascular disease, which is blockage of blood supply to the arms and legs. And that's why like people that smoke, for example, can end up with peripheral vascular disease and then end up with gangrene, and they start losing, fingers or toes and stuff like that because of the lack of blood supply to the extremities. So they're just some broad terms and definitions around what we're talking about today with cardiovascular disease. Okay, so what does the data tell us about cardiovascular disease in Australia? So we still know that there is a high prevalence of a disease. So remember, prevalence is the amount of people that are currently living with it, okay? So 6.7% of adults, so people over the age of 18, have CVD in Australia. This increases drastically with age, so like exponentially if you look at a graph. So if you get to 75 years of age, then you have, I think it's like a 28% chance, so it's over 1 in 4, have CVD. So it might be 6.7% when you include everyone from 18 to X, but when you get to 75 to X, then it's like over 25%. And men are specifically 1.3 times more likely to have CVD. So our incidence rate, so the number of new cases, it's still high, but it is declining, okay? And it has been declining consistently since 2001. Mortality rates are still high, but once the same as our incidence rates, they are declining, and they have been declining consistently since the 1980s, all right? Just on the mortality though, do want to say that it is still accounts for 24% of all deaths here in Australia. It is second behind all cancers. So remember in the previous videos, I discussed how the fact that if you put all the cancers together, they're our number 1 killer in Australia. Well, if you put all the CVD conditions together, they're our number 2 killer in Australia. And then finally, our burden of disease. So this includes like mortality, morbidity, and then obviously ongoing care, etc. It is still very high, all right? It is our leading cause of for males, so burden of disease for males, and hospitalizations are increasing. So if these things are increasing and these things are decreasing, what does that really mean? Okay, how do we summarize this? So less people are dying from CVD, but require ongoing medical treatment to do so, all right? Advances in medical technology, medication, emergency care, and surgical interventions lead to less deaths, but greater burden and greater hospitalizations, all right? Okay, so risk and protective factors. So I've just done risk factors here, and then I'll do protective on another slide. What are our risk factors? So remember, a risk factor for something is an action or a choice that you make which increases the likelihood that you are going to get X, Y, Z. So we're talking about risk factors related to cardiovascular disease. Then we have modifiable and non-modifiable. Modifiable risk factors are the things you have control of. You choose them, all right? Non-modifiable, you don't get a choice, all right? So you just got to make choices to offset the non-modifiable ones, but all the modifiable ones can be changed, all right? And believe it or not, 2 of them account for nearly 70% of all cardiovascular disease deaths. Just 2 choices, all right? What are they? Smoking. Smoking is our first one, all right? And now vaping is thrown into this, okay? So it damages the blood vessels, all right? So having the chemicals go through your bloodstream, all right, does harden up those vessels, leads to arteriosclerosis, which makes little cracks in the vessels, which therefore promotes plaque and clot formation, okay? So if you can imagine, you know, if we go back to my lovely drawing of an artery, all right? That's a nice smooth artery. They're like my arteries, right? No, I don't even know what mine look like. But I don't smoke or I don't vape. So nice smooth arteries like a slip and slide, all right? So imagine you're at the water park and you're going down the slip and slide and it's all smooth, all right? There's no bumps, there's no nothing. And you just go whoop, all the way down the bottom. You're like, oh, that was sick, let's do it again, okay? Now imagine that because you smoke, you've got little cracks in your arteries, okay? Little cracks here. So imagine like at the slip and slide, you've got cracks in the slip and slide, and then you rolled a whole bunch of marbles down it, and we'll call the marbles like plaque and fats, all right? Which is the things you eat, okay? You don't eat marbles. I mean, some of you might. Anyway, so you throw some marbles down the slip and slide, and where the cracks are, some marbles will sit in the cracks, okay? And then all the other marbles will roll past, okay? So, and this is what leads, so a little bit of plaque then can lead to more plaque, can then lead to more plaque, and then lead to the picture I showed you before, okay? So that's why smoking is bad. Smoking is bad. Did you know that? So it promotes plaque and clot formation. Over a third of our cardiovascular disease deaths are related to smoking. So people can like be doing all of the right things, but they smoke and they still die from CVD. Then we've got hypertension, so high blood pressure, probably because of restricted arteries, because of diet and things like that. That is our leading risk factor. So those 2 things together account for over 70% of all cardiovascular disease deaths, which is huge, okay? So if you do have high blood pressure and you smoke, well. Anyway, overweight and obesity is our third modifiable risk factor. So there's nothing actually about you being overweight and obese that makes you get cardiovascular disease. It's comorbidities, all right? It is the things that go along with being overweight and obese, which therefore lead to cardiovascular disease. Like, for example, if you're overweight and obese, you're probably eating too much food, which means you are probably storing some fats and plaque in your blood vessels, which means your blood pressure is probably high, okay? You probably have plaque buildup, okay? Another one, diabetes, all right? Even though diabetes isn't a major thing for most of Australians, if you look at First Nations people, diabetes is extremely high, which therefore leads to cardiovascular disease, okay? Other factors which are modifiable, poor diet, and you can see how poor diet relates to like these things here, okay? Lack of physical activity. So things are being stored in your blood vessels, it's because you're not actually actively using them in your body, all right? That's how weight gain works, all right? So as long as you are exercising enough or doing enough and you're eating to the right amount, you shouldn't be storing anything in your blood vessels because your muscles are using them actively. Alcohol consumption. So alcohol, once again, it's a double whammy. So it, A, hardens the blood vessels because alcohol does naturally dry things out, and B, alcohol is extremely high in calories, and people don't know that. They're like, oh, I'll just have a glass of wine. A glass of wine has 150 to 200 calories, if not more, depending on the size of your glass of wine, that is. And you're having like 2 or 3 of them every night, so all of a sudden there's 500 extra calories. 500 extra calories every day for a week, weight gain. Then we've got our non-modifiable risk factors. Okay, so these are things you can't change but you need to be aware of. So age is the first one. So I already spoke about how when you're at the age of 18, 6.7% of all adults between 18 and X have CVD, but by the time you get to 75, it's 28% of all adults between 75 and X have cardiovascular disease. So as you age, you are more likely to get cardiovascular disease. Your gender, we know that males are more likely to get cardiovascular disease. Now, whether that's actually to do with being a male is probably not true, okay? But it is the behaviors that males generally engage in, going to the pub with their mates, having a couple of beers after footy or soccer or whatever it is, working in jobs where you need fast food because it's like labor intensive, you just need a pick-me-up, so you get a couple of pies and a sausage roll, and then you put the pies and the sausage roll on a bread roll, and you cover that in sauce and butter and smash it down. So those types of things, okay? It's not actually because you're a male, but, male behaviors. Family history and genetics is the third one. So we do know that naturally some people just have smaller blood vessels. So if this is person A and this is person B, hopefully you can see that this one is meant to be smaller than this one, all right? And they have the same lifestyle, they same foods, they do all the same stuff. And they start accumulating plaque. Well, let's say we accumulate this amount of plaque. Let's accumulate that same amount of plaque in this blood vessel. You can see all of a sudden that the blood flow here and the blood flow here are significantly different. And there's nothing different between them except for genetics. So they are our risk factors. So I'll quickly rub this off and go through protective factors. Okay, so what are our leading protective factors? All right, so these are the things that, if we look at what the risk factors are, well, these are the things that are basically the direct opposites, which would help you stop getting those, partaking in the risk factors. So our first one is maintaining or consuming a healthy, balanced diet, low in saturated and trans-saturated fats. Textbook also does say sodium. Now, I've put a little asterisk there for sodium because we know that athletes and people who are active actually need more sodium, and the sodium that athletes need is actually above the recommended daily intake for Australians, okay? So sodium, if you are obviously overweight and obese and you have high blood pressure and then you're consuming a lot of sodium, yes, that is significantly bad because sodium obviously draws more fluid into the blood vessels, and if your blood vessels are already constricted from plaque, etc., and you are increasing the pressure by putting more fluid in there, then bad things happen, okay? But for a healthy, active person, nothing wrong with sodium. Second one, we've got meeting the physical activity guidelines, okay? So the guidelines currently say 60 minutes of moderate to vigorous physical activity on, I think it's 5 days a week or most days of the week, and on 3 days of the week you're meant to do strength training, but most people are not doing 60 minutes of moderate to vigorous. So moderate to vigorous isn't like walking, it's like, you're getting your heart rate into that or above that aerobic threshold at like 65%, okay? And most people don't do that. And to be fair, I probably don't do that. All right, I do go to the gym regularly and I do weights and I do walk on the treadmill a lot, but I'm probably not aerobically trained. So that's something that I could do if my GP said, oh, your blood pressure is getting a bit high there. So our third one is regular GP checkups or preventative checkups. So just going to the GP, particularly if you're a male, and particularly if you've got family history, and just saying, hey, nothing wrong with me, I don't think. Let's just do a checkup, and they check your height, your weight, your blood pressure, mental health, diet, all that kind of stuff. Because you may feel like you are healthy and there's nothing wrong with you, but then the tests may show otherwise, okay? So regular GP checkups for preventative measure. And then the obvious ones, okay? These are the ones that my daughters in primary school can identify. Not smoking, not vaping, not consuming large amounts of alcohol, etc., okay? Yeah, so there are risk and protective factors. I'll rub this off and then we've got one more part to cardiovascular disease. All right, so our final part is like where and for whom is CVD changing? So like what are our groups really that are suffering from CVD? So none of this is new information. If you've done the previous videos in this series that I've been filming for HMS, all of this will be just a refresh for you. So First Nations people, we know that they're 2.1 times more likely to suffer from cardiovascular diseases. They had 2.8 times higher acute events. An acute event is like where you need to rush to the hospital straight away because something bad is happening. It's not like an ongoing burden of disease. So we're talking about things like heart attack, stroke, etc. Okay, so that's bad, obviously. Lower SES, so SES socioeconomic status, so people who are in the lowest SES category, they have a 1.5 times higher mortality rate, but they have similar prevalence, okay? So low SES to high SES, roughly the same amount of people have CVD or CVD type conditions, but when it actually comes to events like heart attack, stroke, etc., so the things that are going to kill you, low SES people are 1.5 times higher to actually die from it, as opposed to people that are in higher SES. So why? So we've got like reduced health literacy, less access to specialized care, lower quality diet, higher smoking and alcohol rates, etc. And just for the fact that people in higher SES are able to get care, or they have private care to get themselves sorted, whereas people in low SES don't have the spare money to do that. Rural and remote populations, they have 35% higher hospitalizations due to CVD, and a lot of that is driven through the significantly higher smoking rates, which I did talk about in our previous rural and remote video. And finally, men. Okay, we obviously know that men do have a disproportionately higher rate of CVD to women. Women are still very high, and even though the rates of men and women have both been declining, they've sort of been declining at the same rate, or the women's rate is actually declining slightly higher or slightly more. Okay, it's like 64% versus 60%. So yeah, so these are the groups or the communities that do suffer more from cardiovascular disease. And that overall is the end of our deep dive on cardiovascular disease. Thanks.